Over 400 miles north of London is Balmoral, the Queen's private estate in Scotland, where she spends her annual holiday. This year, the Sun newspaper reported that Her Majesty will remain at the castle to appoint her new Prime Minister after the result of the Conservative leadership election is declared. The outgoing leader, Boris Johnson, will reportedly have to travel up to Royal Deeside to tender his resignation, and his successor will then be summoned by the Queen to be asked to form a new government. In its reporting of the story, the Sun described it as an historic first, being the first time in the Queen's reign that a Prime Minister will have been appointed somewhere other than Buckingham Palace. Other news reports also use this phrase, repeating that it would be an historic first for the appointment to take place at Balmoral. And while it's true that the current Queen has never done so before, this inevitably got me wondering about the longer term history, and asking the question, has a Prime Minister ever been appointed at Balmoral? To find out, it's time to go back to the archive. Hello and welcome to Back to the Archive, where we answer questions of political history by looking at historical archives. And there's lots of different types of archive. Traditional paper ones like these with miles of shelving, but also electronic archives, and it's one of those that I'm going to be using today. I'm delving into the online archives of the Times newspaper, which you can access on their website with a subscription, but I'm going to be accessing it via another subscription service from the academic publisher Gale, which provides all of these databases for students and academics, and if you're at university you should be able to access some of those for yourself. I'm going to be obviously using the Times online archive, and we can do an advanced search using specific search terms and date ranges. Search term Balmoral we have used today. So that's the archive that we're going to be using, and also a bit of archive footage as well. But let's begin with a look at the history of Prime Ministers and their visits to Balmoral. It's now a long-standing tradition that the British Prime Minister makes an annual visit to stay at Balmoral, and that goes all the way back to the 1840s when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert first acquired the estate. And the first Prime Minister to visit was Lord John Russell, who visited in September 1848, the very first year that Victoria and Albert themselves stayed there, and before that they'd even built the castle that we see today. Lord John returned the following year and was amongst the guests celebrating Prince Albert's birthday with a party in the castle grounds in August. Other Prime Ministers followed throughout Victoria's reign, with their visits recorded in the court circular published in the Times or in the news pages. One of these visits, by Benjamin Disraeli, was dramatised in the 1997 film Mrs Brown, which portrays the Prime Minister arriving at Balmoral in 1868 to stay with the Queen, who is still in deep mourning for her late husband, 7 years after his death. Disraeli seeks the help of her Highland servant John Brown to persuade Victoria to return to public duties following growing criticism in the press of her absence from the public. Queen Victoria's successors as monarch also welcomed Prime Ministers to Balmoral, and in the archives we can find reports of Arthur Balfour visiting King Edward VII in 1903, Stanley Baldwin staying with George V in 1925, and Neville Chamberlain staying with George VI in 1937. In the post-war period, Clement Attlee first visited in 1945 as guest of George VI, and after the current Queen succeeded to the throne in 1952, she's invited every one of her Prime Ministers to stay at Balmoral. Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, who also made a flying visit in 1959 to seek a dissolution of Parliament, Alec Douglas Hume, Harold Wilson, Edward Heath, James Callaghan, and then Margaret Thatcher, whose first visit was dramatised in the Netflix series The Crown, showing the Prime Minister rather out of her comfort zone as she accompanies the Queen out walking. John Major's first visit in 1991 was caught on camera in a BBC documentary, where we see his audience with the Queen in which they discuss world events before going on a walk around the grounds. Tony Blair had a decade of annual visits to get used to the ways of Balmoral, although in his memoirs he says he never really did, whilst his successor Gordon Brown may have felt more at home in his native Scotland. One of David Cameron's visits was also captured in a television documentary, where we see the Prime Minister arrive for his audience with the Queen. They're seen discussing important matters of state, as well as the walking and fishing that Cameron had done the previous day. Theresa May followed in 2016 and later related a story of how the Duke of Edinburgh had suggested to her and her husband a very long walk, which took them hours, only for them to discover that Prince Philip normally did it in a Land Rover. Finally, Boris Johnson made his first visit in 2019, accompanied by his future wife Carrie. The annual visit was cancelled in 2020 during the coronavirus pandemic, but the Prime Minister and his wife returned in 2021, the most recent visit at the time of recording. But have any of these Prime Ministers been appointed at Balmoral? In normal times, Prime Ministers have kissed hands at Buckingham Palace, with the trip up the Mall by the outgoing and incoming Prime Ministers forming part of the modern drama and ceremonial of a change of government. That's been the setting for all such appointments during the Queen's reign, but there have been some more unusual venues in the past. In 1908, the Liberal Prime Minister, Henry Campbell Bannerman, resigned through ill health while King Edward VII was on holiday in Biarritz in the south of France. The King summoned the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Herbert Asquith, who had to make the journey down to Biarritz, where he kissed hands as Prime Minister at the Hôtel du Palais. During Queen Victoria's reign, we've already noted that after the death of her husband, the Prince Consort, the Queen withdrew from public life, spending long periods of time in seclusion away from London. In 1868, Benjamin Disraeli had to travel to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, when he was summoned by the Queen to become Prime Minister for the first time. So, might there have been an example of the same happening at Balmoral? In trying to answer that, I found myself in the archive back in 1885.
1885!
Yes, 1885. A very appropriate year for this first Back to the Future themed video. But whilst Marty McFly was trying to bring the doc back from America's Wild West, on this side of the Atlantic, the country was in political crisis, with the sudden resignation of William Gladstone's Liberal government in June, whilst the Queen was at Balmoral. Urgent messages were sent to Scotland, but the Queen didn't return immediately. Instead, she summoned the Conservative leader Lord Salisbury, who arrived at Balmoral on the 12th of June and had an audience of the Queen before leaving the following day. At his second audience, the court circular reported that he had accepted office and then returned to London to begin forming his government. So, there we have it. A Prime Minister has previously accepted office from the monarch at an audience at Balmoral. So, case closed? Not quite. Because although Lord Salisbury had accepted office, it took further negotiations to confirm that he could put together a government, by which time the Queen had returned to Windsor, and it was there, at Windsor Castle, down south, that Lord Salisbury eventually kissed hands as Prime Minister, after Gladstone had said his goodbyes. So, will it be an historic first? Well, yes and no. As we've seen, it will be a first for Queen Elizabeth II to appoint a Prime Minister at Balmoral, but the prospect evokes strong echoes of her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. This link between Prime Ministers and Balmoral is a history that Her Majesty herself seems to know all too well, as this last wonderful piece of archive TV footage demonstrates.
Really?
Have you been round quite a lot of the places?
We went to La Shields, I think.
Oh, right up the lot.
Yeah,
Oh, right,
yes, ma'am.
yes.
Yeah.
Queen Victoria's house.
Yeah.
She used to make the Prime Minister come up and see her there.